All right, let's just jump right in. What is humanity's biggest problem? Seriously. And what if the solution is something totally unexpected? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dive deep into a theological framework that gives a pretty radical diagnosis and an even more radical cure. Okay, so everything we're about to talk about really hinges on this one big question. We're going to be pulling from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Colossians to look at a really specific diagnosis of the human condition and, of course, the proposed remedy. But first things first, you got to understand the problem, right?
So let's start with the diagnosis. Theologians like Martin Lloyd-Jones have made the point that you can't really appreciate the cure until you understand just how serious the disease is. And wow, according to the book of Colossians, the picture of our natural state is, well, it's pretty stark. We're talking about a profound separation from God.
Paul doesn't mince words, uses three really powerful terms to describe this state. He says people are naturally alienated, that we're enemies in our mind, and that this whole internal state leads to wicked works. So, what on earth do those terms actually mean? Let's break them down. Okay, first up, alienated. Think of it like being a foreigner living in a country where you're not a citizen. You're there, but you're not really part of its life. You're estranged. So, according to this view, it's not just that we're far from God. There's a real barrier. The idea is that people naturally live these independent lives, not really seeking God. And if we're honest, maybe even a little afraid of Him deep down. But wait, it gets even more intense. The next term is enemies in mind. Whoa. This isn't just a passive separation, like we're just drifting apart. No, this is active hostility. And get this, the source of this hostility isn't what we do, it's what we think. It's rooted right in our minds, in our core thinking. It's this deep, inner resistance to God's authority and His truth. And to really drive this point home, Dr. Lloyd-Jones would often quote this verse from the book of Romans. The claim here is pretty bold. It's saying that the natural human mind, before any kind of spiritual renewal, isn't neutral. It's not just ignorant. It is fundamentally at odds with God's law and His entire character. So, what does this enmity actually look like in day-to-day life? I mean, that sounds pretty extreme. Well, the sources we're looking at give some really concrete examples. It could be something as subtle as a feeling that God is kind of against you, or maybe that secret little bit of relief you feel when you hear someone question His existence. It can also show up when we reject the parts of God's character we don't like, or when we see His rules as something that just spoils our fun instead of protecting us. Okay, so this diagnosis, it leads to a huge question, doesn't it? If the problem is this deep, this active internal hostility, then just saying sorry or trying to be a better person isn't going to cut it. It's just not enough. So how in the world is a peaceful relationship with God even possible? And that brings us to the solution.
And the answer, according to this framework, is that the solution has to come from God's side. It can't come from us. This is the whole idea of reconciliation, and it's something accomplished entirely through the work of Jesus Christ.
Now, Paul gets super specific about how this reconciliation happened. He says it was done in the body of His flesh through death. And listen, that is not just some poetic phrase. Every single word there is loaded with theological meaning. So let's unpack that a bit. The phrase body of His flesh was absolutely crucial for the early church. It was a direct counter to some heresies that claimed Jesus wasn't really human. Then you have through death. This points to the idea that a sacrifice was needed to deal with our guilt. But the most important part, this was all God's idea. It was His initiative. He's the one reaching out to do the reconciling, not the other way around. All right, so we've looked at the problem and we've seen the proposed solution. So what's the result? What happens? Well, according to the text, it is nothing short of a complete, total, radical transformation of a person standing before God. And this comparison here really lays it all out. You go from the before picture, alienated, hostile, under wrath, to the after picture, presented right before God, holy and totally blameless. It's a complete 180-degree turn from being an enemy to being a beloved child. Just a massive shift. So what about these new terms? What do they mean? Well, holy means you're set apart for God. Unblameable means you're without blemish, kind of like a perfect sacrifice in the Old Testament. And unreprovable, that's a legal term. It means there is absolutely no charge that can be brought against you in God's courtroom. It's a full and complete pardon. But, the passage doesn't just stop there. It adds a really crucial bit about what this reconciled life actually looks like in practice. So now we're going to get into the evidence of this whole transformation. And here it is. This is the line that trips a lot of people up and raises so many questions. Right after describing this incredible act of reconciliation, Paul adds, if indeed you continue in the faith. So what's up with that if? What does that mean? Does this mean our salvation depends on us, on our own power to just hold on? Does it mean we can somehow earn it by sticking it out, or maybe even lose it if we mess up? Well, theologians in the Reformed tradition have a very, very specific answer to this question. They make a huge distinction between what some, like R.C. Sproul, have called a mere profession versus a true possession of faith. See, a mere profession might just be a one-time decision you made years ago that didn't really change anything. But true possession, that's a living, breathing, enduring reality. It's not perfect, for sure, but it perseveres and it actually produces spiritual fruit over time. John MacArthur puts it really plainly. That if clause, it isn't a condition we have to meet to earn our reconciliation. Instead, our continuing in the faith is the evidence, it's the proof that we were truly reconciled to begin with. In other words, endurance is the hallmark of a genuine saving faith. Think of it like a building. Theologians like Calvin and Sproul have used this metaphor. To be grounded and settled means your faith is resting on the solid, unshakable foundation of the gospel itself. It's not about how strong you are, it's about how stable the foundation is that you're building on. A faith that isn't grounded on that solid truth, well, it's going to get knocked over pretty easily. So let's bring it all home. What's the big takeaway here? Look, whether you agree with this framework or not, you have to admit it presents a really radical view of the human problem. It's not just about us making bad choices. It's about having a hostile heart. And because the problem is so radical, the solution has to be just as radical. It's not about self-improvement. It's about a divine rescue. And that leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. How does a perspective like this change our view of humanity and where we ultimately decide to place our hope?